Hello everyone. Before we get started, make sure to like and subscribe, and leave a comment saying where you're from and when you watched. That way, YouTube will continue to show you stories like this. Now, let's get started. Asterisk, from the moment I moved into my new home in a small town in the Delta, I felt that something was wrong. Things that were difficult to explain were always present, like a fragile mist covering the space. Sometimes in an empty room, sometimes in the corner of my hallway. I thought it was just the familiar feeling of a mother when she has to move suddenly, leaving behind old memories. But the truth is, from the first day, my son Daniel began to act in a way that scared me. Daniel was only 7 years old, smart and thoughtful. He loved to draw. He could sit for hours in front of a sketchbook, sketching out his imagination. At first, I thought it was just his way of relieving the loneliness after leaving his old school and friends. But after only a week, I realized that all of Daniel's paintings had one strange thing in common. In each painting was the silhouette of a woman. The woman had long, disheveled hair that covered half her face. She had no name, no clear details, just a silhouette, but always stood behind the main character in the painting. Sometimes she was in the yard, sometimes she was in the window, sometimes she stood at the end of the hallway. All were in a normal space, like my kitchen, the living room, or even my son's bedroom. Each painting was like a snapshot of reality, except that there was always a silhouette of a woman standing, looking in Daniel's direction. At first, I tried to ask my son why he had drawn this woman. Daniel just smiled and said that this was his friend. A very good friend who always wanted to play with him. The words sounded very innocent, but in my heart, I was filled with worry. How could a child imagine such a specific image, especially when he confirmed that he had never met this woman in real life? I thought it was just a child's rich imagination, so I let it go for now. But then, strange events began to happen in our own house. At night, I often heard footsteps walking slowly in the hallway. When I went out to check, there was no one, only a deafening silence. Sometimes I found that Daniel's door was not closed enough for me to lock it before going to sleep. Daniel was still sleeping soundly, with no signs of being woken up. But the thing that made me tremble the most was when I accidentally saw a new painting of my son. In the painting was my living room, with a sofa, a tea table, everything like in real life. But in the corner of the room stood a silhouette of a woman with a veiled face, as if looking directly at the viewer. I turned to the corner of the room. Of course, there was no one, but the feeling of being watched still did not go away. I began to fear, not only for myself, but also for my son. Daniel affirmed that the woman in the painting was very kind, that she told him that she would protect him. But I could not help but think of the chilling scares I had read in the dark stories. If there really was a force in the house, what would happen to my son? Many nights I couldn't sleep, just sitting in the hallway looking into Daniel's room. B was still sleeping, but on his desk, new pictures kept appearing. Daniel came without me knowing, or he woke up when I was asleep. That made me feel even more haunted. One time I dared to collect all of Daniel's papers and throw them away, thinking that this would be the only way to escape. But after only a few days, on his new notebook, the image of the woman still returned. This time clearer, more detailed, like a portrait being completed day by day. My son started to become more calm, smiled less. B said that the woman was no longer far away, she was near. Every time Daniel returned, the woman was no longer standing in the corner of the house, but right behind the baby, as if she were always by his side. The story from that day made my spine shiver. My heart beat fast, and I was filled with anxiety. I began to learn about the history of the house, asking the neighbors around, but no one knew much. Our house had been abandoned for many years. The owner was a single woman. It was unclear why she suddenly disappeared. This only increased the sadness in me. What if the woman Daniel returned to was the owner of the house? What if she was still here, in another form? Every step, every sound, every shadow in the house became suspicious. I did not know whether to believe in my own reason or in my son's thoughts, but the feeling of a pair of eyes following me and Daniel became clearer and clearer. The question is, how can a child describe clearly a person he has never met? Are there connections that we do not understand, and if so, things have only just begun? Then one night, I saw the image of that woman, not on paper, but in real life. In my living room, I stared at the image without a sound and understood that our story was only beginning. After that night, I was no longer myself. The living room with the shadow of the woman standing silently in the dark became a place of darkness that haunted me every day and every hour. I did not dare to sit alone anymore. Every small movement in the house made me panic. Daniel did not seem to notice the change in me. He continued to talk about his invisible friend with a cold joy. The next morning, I took Daniel back and asked about the woman. Daniel smiled sweetly and said that her name was Sarah. This name appeared so suddenly that it made me shiver. He said that Sarah had told him many things, that she used to live in this very house and that she did not want to leave. The story of a young child sounded like a normal story, but in my heart, it was like a prophecy. I began to learn more about the area around the house. The neighbors only vaguely remembered that she was a woman who lived alone without a family. No one knew why she had disappeared for a day. No one had seen her. The house had been abandoned for years before I bought it. There was no clear information about her death or departure, just rumors. Rumors often contain more truth than we think. Every night Daniel had new pictures. What made me look closely was the details in the pictures becoming clearer. At first it was just a shadowy figure. Now it had a face half covered by long hair, but the other half was a cold smile. The steps of old Dan felt like a reminder that Sarah really existed right next to me. On Tuesday night, I couldn't stand it anymore, so I took all the pictures and went to the backyard to burn them. The fire was so bright that it lit up a corner of the sky. I thought I had escaped, but no. The next day, Daniel obediently sat down and painted another picture, which was no longer a scene like before, but a portrait. In the picture was a woman with dark eyes and a dark smile. When I asked him how he could paint it so clearly, Daniel only said that last night his mother had sat right next to his bed and watched him for a long time. I was so scared that I didn't dare to open my eyes or turn it off. This apparition was so clear that I couldn't escape. Many nights, I heard someone screaming softly in the hallway, like the sound of a hand hitting the wall. When I opened the door, I saw nothing but Daniel sleeping, but there was a new picture on his desk. Every detail of the house became a new mark of truth. On the living room wall, there were stains that I had never seen before, as if someone had used a hand to scratch them. The stains were shaped like the lines on Daniel's painting. Every time I did, I thought of the two words, horror stories. I had heard online about people leaving scars when they returned. Daniel did not smile as much as before. B became quieter and often whispered in my ear that Sarah had started to talk to him more. He said that she told me about her lonely life and that she wanted a new family. Every word I told was like a challenge to my faith. If everything was just my imagination, why did every detail match what I was going through? I began to dread every time I had to work in the house alone. My shadow on the wall sometimes did not synchronize with my movements. When I took a step, it seemed to stand still. But the rainy nights were mild, and I went down to the house and saw clearly a shadow standing in the second-floor window. The shadow of a woman with long, disheveled hair looked down. I could not hold back my tears. I just stood there, my heart pounding in my chest. Every night was a journey for me, not knowing how to face it. But I began to understand that Sarah was no longer just on paper. She had entered our living space. And the most horrifying thing was that Daniel seemed happy about it. I thought I had a real friend, but I knew my family was on the verge of a monster. Every horror story I read about became a reality in my own life with my son. Every time Daniel cut a new picture, I knew she was getting closer. If it was all an illusion, then why did I see the shadow last night? If it was all an imagination, then why did the screams in the future become real? It was just beginning, and I knew that what lay ahead was much more. Terrifying than ever, I had hoped that the appearance was just a lie. I realized that Sarah had become a part of this house, a part of our lives. And then, one night, Daniel was no longer only about the woman, but he started to think about me holding Sarah as if we were family. I felt cold, my heart was pounding, and I knew that the story had just reached my grave. I didn't dare look at Daniel's pictures anymore, but she kept bringing them to me. Each picture was like a piece of a puzzle that was gradually being completed. Daniel had started to color more carefully now. In the latest picture, Sarah's face appeared more clearly than ever. She had the palest skin like the winter sky. Her eyes were so deep that they seemed to suck the soul of the person looking at them. Daniel said that Sarah was not just standing at the end of the hallway anymore, but was sitting on the sofa in the living room where I had seen her the night before. She said that she had talked to her like a true friend, saying that she was sad because she had been abandoned for many years. Each story the boy told was like a part of the endless number of ghost stories I had heard. But the difference was that this was no longer another story, but was happening in my own house. Every night I would hear strange noises. Sometimes it was a soft laugh coming from the corner of the living room. Sometimes it was the creaking of the window, even though everything was already frozen. But when I went to check, I never saw anyone. There were only marks on the floor that looked like the feet of a woman walking by. I didn't dare tell the neighbors, for fear they would think I had lost my mind. Daniel began to change quickly. He rarely wanted to go out, rarely wanted to talk to his classmates. He only wanted to go home to paint and talk to Sarah. Every time I noticed, I saw her occasionally turn to a corner of the house, as if someone was sitting there. Every time, she would smile and continue on as if nothing had happened. My fear reached a climax one night when I was sleeping and was startled awake by the sound of a steady knocking, sound coming from Daniel's room. I ran in and saw her sitting on the bed, writing on the wall in black letters. The letters were in indecipherable letters. When I asked her what she was doing, Daniel said that Sarah had asked her to write her name on the wall so that she would not be forgotten. I stared at the picture, unable to say a word. Sarah's name appeared clearly on the wall in letters that seemed to flow out of a child's lips. My heart was pounding in my chest. The next day I called again, but Daniel did the same thing. This time, the baby looked into my eyes and said that Sarah wanted to stay, and no one was allowed to interfere. Every time I thought about leaving this house and going away, something stopped me. It was like something inside me had been pulled into this house. Every time I packed my bags, I saw Daniel become a little inconsolable, crying and begging me not to leave Sarah. The plea was cold and sounded like a ghost coming from somewhere deep in the dark. But when the rain and the night were dark, I could hear the woman singing softly from above. The song was like a lullaby, but it was not filled with sadness. Daniel slept soundly, as if he were being lulled by that voice. My son was silent, unable to continue his song. At times like these, I realized that things had gone beyond the limits of ordinary ghost stories. Sarah's presence was no longer just on paper or in Daniel's words. She was becoming a part of this house and could be felt more and more. Every passing shadow, every creak of the door could be a sign of her presence. I began to sleep frequently without someone to confide in. Such long conversations only made me feel that I was touching the limit of madness. One night, I saw clearly something that I could not explain. In the mirror on the bedroom wall appeared the image of me and Daniel. But standing behind us was a woman with long hair and a cold smile. I turned back to look but saw nothing. Looking in the mirror, the shadow was still there. Every line matched Daniel's picture. I was so terrified that I fell to the floor. From that night, I understood that Sarah was not just a shadow, but a force trying to survive in this family. My son seemed to have become a tool for her to exist. Things were happening more and more clearly, that every step and every story Daniel told was a piece of the puzzle, leading to Sarah becoming a real member of the house. Everyone thought ghost stories were just stories that people imagined, but when they became real, it took away all your hope and peace. I could only pray that one day I would find a way to free both of us. But deep down I knew that it was just a dream. It was at this point that I began to understand clearly that Sarah did not want to be with Daniel. She wanted to replace me. Every time I looked at the picture of my son, I could see myself fading away, leaving only Sarah and Daniel together as a real family. Every time I did that, I knew I was being pushed back from my own life. Asterisk, and then I realized that in the last episode, Daniel had drawn another picture. It wasn't just Sarah with the baby anymore, but the two of them were holding hands in front of their mother, who was dreaming just like me. I knew the story was going to the point of no return, but I still couldn't stop it. After the night I saw Sarah in the mirror, I was no longer the same person. Every dream was cut off. Every shadow that passed by the window made me jump. Daniel became closer and closer to her. My son no longer called me Mum with the same familiarity as before. Many times he just looked at me with a distant look, and then ran to the corner of the room to talk to someone only he could see. I began to see Daniel change both in his behavior and appearance. He became paler, but his eyes became dark and mysterious. Every time I asked him what his happiness was, Daniel said it was being with Sarah. The answer was cold, like a knife stabbing into my heart. I was his mother, but now he considered me less than the only person he needed. Every night I walked into Daniel's room. His desk was covered with new pictures. They were no longer ordinary scenes, but extraordinary pictures. There was a picture of Sarah and Daniel holding hands in front of a brightly lit house, with his mother just a tiny shadow. There was a picture of Daniel sleeping on his bed, Sarah sitting next to him, stroking his hair with a cold smile. Every picture was a reminder that I was handing my son over to someone else. Every night I tried to keep Daniel by my side. I locked the bedroom door with my son and turned off all the lights and prayed that Sarah couldn't get in. But the next morning I saw signs that she was there. Shadows were still there on the ceiling even after I had turned off the lights. The fragile footsteps on the wooden floor led to the bed. Many times I heard someone's voice whispering right next to me. The strangeness increased. Daniel started calling Sarah Mom. Every time I heard her call me that, I felt like a bronze statue. She occasionally looked at me with a challenging smile, as if she had a new choice. I did not dare to face the truth that I was being replaced. All the things I had considered as haunted stories were happening to my own family. I went to the church at the end of the street to ask the pastor about the curse or some way to reconcile. After listening, he just gathered people in silence and said that there were wandering souls who could not find a place to go and would cling to people who were in love, especially children. Because children were innocent, they could connect with the souls of adults. The only solution he gave was to cut off that connection before it was too late. But how could I cut it when Daniel had already considered Sarah as everything? Every day became a struggle. I always felt eyes following my every move. While cooking, I saw the shadow of a woman appear on the refrigerator door. While lying down, I saw the shadow of a long-haired woman appear in the mirror. At night, I clearly saw a shadow sitting next to Daniel's bed. Everything became proof that Sarah was no longer a shadow but had entered our lives. Daniel increasingly insisted that Sarah was good. She said that she told her many stories about the past and many secrets, like a real mother. I did not dare to imagine if one day she chose to stay with Sarah and left me out. Every feeling was like a knife stabbing deeper than every day. One night, I was sound asleep and startled by a faint laugh in the bedroom. When I opened my eyes, I saw that Daniel was no longer on the bed. I ran to the living room and froze when I saw the scene before me. Daniel was sitting on Sarah's lap, a vague but clear shape. Sarah stroked Daniel's hair as if he was really her son. Her eyes were cold and she smiled like she had one. I couldn't form a word, I just stood there, motionless. I shook from head to toe when I saw my son in her arms for a moment. Daniel turned to me and said that she was afraid. It was only Sarah. It sounded like a friend concluding that I was the loser. I turned and ran back to the closed room of the department. The question that kept ringing in my mind was how to save my son from the clutches of a spirit. But every time I thought about running away from this house, I thought about that cold face. It was as if Sarah had known all my choices before. Every sound in the house was a warning that I had very little time before losing everything. If I didn't find a way to save Daniel, tomorrow my son might no longer be mine. But how to fight a spirit that had been chosen by my son to be his mother? I decided I couldn't keep quiet any longer. Every time I saw my son fall into Sarah's arms, my heart was torn apart. I was Daniel's mother, but now he was looking for more than just protection and love. The feeling made me explode. I knew I had to face Sarah, even if it meant losing everything. I started by locking Daniel's door every night. He cried and called for Sarah, but I tried not to. But that only made things worse. In the middle of the night, I heard a soft laugh in the hallway, like a woman was happy about something. I opened the door and saw my shadow scattered on the floor. But after that, I saw Daniel no longer resisting staying with me. B became cold and said that if I continued to stop him, Sarah would get angry and not be able to protect him anymore. Those cold words made my stomach churn. In the horror stories I had heard, people often told me that children were more easily targeted than manipulated. Now I had witnessed this happening to my own child. Daniel was no longer the cheerful child he used to be. Every word he said now had a cold edge. I tried everything to get him back. I took Daniel to the park, to his friend's house, to his grandparents' house. But no matter where he went, he only wanted to go home and see Sarah's paintings. He said that only in this house could he be close to Sarah. There was a time when Daniel was determined to hold the picture close to his chest, as if he was afraid I would steal it away. The boy who looked so different from the boy I knew. I began to lose sleep constantly. On rainy nights, I would hear the sound of hands on the window. Sometimes the sound would last for hours, like a reminder that Sarah was still there, getting ready to go in. Many nights I would lie still and listen to the woman's soft, almost wind-like voice. Those words became Daniel's lullaby. Even the daytime was no longer a safe place. When I was cooking, I saw the woman's shadow reflected on the knife. When I was washing the dishes, I saw her long-haired shadow clearly in the water. Each time, my heart would pound and my hands would shake. I could no longer tell what was real and what was a dream. One morning, I found a new picture on Daniel's table. In it were the three of us, Daniel and Sarah, sitting together like a real family. But what was even more horrifying was that I was a mere shadow in humility. Sarah was clearly there with a cold smile. Each picture was a warning that I was slowly disappearing from my son's life. I took my things to leave the house, but Daniel reacted in a very bad way. He cried and said Sarah would never forgive him if he left. It didn't sound like a child flying away, but like a warning from Sarah herself. I was so moved that I threw everything away. In that moment, I realized that I had no control. Every time I tried to stop, it only got worse. I tried to place a cross on Daniel's bed, but I was awakened in the middle of the night by a terrible noise. The cross fell to the floor and was broken. Daniel was just sleeping soundly in bed with a smile on his face. I was trembling with the realization that Sarah was no longer just a spirit, but had the ability to interfere with matter. Every minute in this house was a struggle between me and Sarah, but the truth was that I had no chance unless I found a way to sever my son's connection with her. But that was not easy, because Daniel now not only trusted Sarah but loved her like a mother. Every word I said was rejected with a cold look. One night I decided to look directly. I stood in front of the bedroom mirror and called Sarah's name. For a moment nothing happened and I thought I was dead. But then a shadowy figure emerged from my shadow. Her long hair fell like a chain in the sky. My eyes met hers in the mirror, a cold, emotionless look. Sarah smiled softly, and that smile was a confirmation that she would never leave. I felt cold all over, no strength in my limbs. But then I heard Daniel's voice behind me. He said that Mum wouldn't worry, Sarah would take care of us. Those cold words were like a final decision. I knew that this fight was not just to save my son, but to save myself from being consumed by Sarah's presence. But as I was still wondering what to do, Daniel painted a new picture. In it, Sarah and the baby were walking hand in hand over the threshold of the house where my son stood, with only a shadow beside him. It was like a prophecy being fulfilled. After sleepless nights, I decided I couldn't just sit there and let Sarah's shadow consume this family. If I wanted to save Daniel, I had to find out who Sarah was and why her ghost couldn't leave this house. I started searching for anything that had anything to do with the history of the house. In the small basement closet, I found some old boxes. The dust was so thick that I had to wear gloves and a mask to open each box. Inside were papers related to the house's previous owner. Her name was Sarah Mitchell. There were old utility bills, unclaimed letters, and some dark old photos. Among those photos were pictures of Sarah alone on the porch with a gloomy expression. The other pictures were of the house with my grandmother sitting on the sofa in the living room, a place that Daniel often returned to in his paintings. What made me shiver was that many of the pictures had scars on their faces, as if someone had tried to steal them. I took the papers to ask one of the oldest neighbors in the neighborhood. This old woman said that Sarah Mitchell was a very reclusive woman who lived a life of not communicating with anyone. Everyone knew that she had a child, but that child had disappeared without a trace. After that, Sarah became a sad shadow and did not leave the house. One day, no one saw her again and the house was abandoned until I bought it. Each story was like a piece of a puzzle put together in a long picture. If Daniel could replace Sarah, then she must be looking for another child to replace the one she had lost. The more I listened, the colder I felt. This was completely consistent with Daniel constantly thinking of Sarah as a second mother. When I got home, I tried to talk to Daniel again, but he just smiled coldly and said that his mother did not understand that Sarah was very sad and just wanted someone to love. The story sounded like a joke, but in my heart it was a warning. Daniel had been lured into a game that he himself did not realize. In the following days, I felt Sarah's presence more and more clearly. There was a faint smell of old perfume in the house. Many nights, I clearly saw a shadow pass the end of the hallway and disappear into Daniel's room. Each time, my heart pounded so hard that it felt like it was about to explode. One night, I boldly walked into Daniel's room while he was sleeping. On the table was a new painting. In it was not only Sarah and Daniel, but also another woman whose face had been completely erased. I realized that the erased woman was me. My hands were shaking and I dropped the papers on the floor. Daniel was sleeping soundly with a smile on his face. I was determined to find out the truth, so I went back to the warehouse again. In a box of papers, I found an old diary. The yellow pages made me read very carefully. It was Sarah Mitchell's diary. The cold words told of her sadness when her son disappeared. The last few lines were filled with despair, that she would never leave this house, that she would stay until she found the child she had lost. Each word was like a vow. I felt Sarah's cold arm on my shoulder as I read the last line. I shook my head and ran out of the house, the soft laughter still echoing behind me. From that night on, I had no more doubts. Sarah had chosen Daniel to replace her child. Every moment was a step closer to that goal. Every conversation Daniel told was a confession to choose Sarah over me. Every hour, every minute, I felt myself being excluded from my own child's life. Daniel was now not only thinking about Sarah, but also about a family in which I no longer existed. I laughed with those thoughts, as if I really had a new family. Every night I woke up to hear footsteps on the ceiling, but there was no sound in the house. Every time I ran upstairs, I felt the darkness of the house, and the sound of footsteps was clear right next to my ear. Everything became proof that Sarah's wish was coming true. I understood that I could not let this game go on any longer, or I would lose Daniel forever. But wanting to play the card more and using emotions to take my son was not a simple thing. I knew I had to find someone who understood these supernatural events to help me. After reading Sarah's diary, I knew I couldn't handle it anymore. Everything that happened in the house was beyond my control. My son was changing day by day, and the cold smile on his face was a sign that Sarah was getting closer to achieving her goal. If I didn't do something, I would lose him forever. I went to an old friend who recommended a man named Richard. He was considered by everyone in the area to be someone who could understand and communicate with the other world. At first, I was reluctant to believe that I was about to commit to something I had only heard about in stories. But when I thought of Daniel, I knew I had no choice. I met Richard on a dark afternoon. He was an old man with a dark face and a deep voice. He was silent for a long time when I told him everything. Then he said that Sarah's spirit had become an inseparable part of the house. He said that when a soul is caught in sadness and darkness, it will find a way to cling to the people it can connect with most. Children with pure hearts are the perfect target. His words seemed like the perfect explanation for what I had witnessed. Richard agreed to come to my house to check it out. As soon as he set foot in the door, he stopped and looked around with a dark look. He said that the air in the house was very hot and cold, as if someone was watching our every move. Daniel, when he saw him, just kept quiet and went into the back room. B did not want to talk to anyone but Sarah. This made Richard even more certain that the connection between Daniel and Sarah had become very strong. That night he sat with me in the living room with all the lights off except for one candle. He said that sometimes the darkness would make the spirits go crazy. I sat next to him and my heart pounded. After a few minutes, the air became heavy and cold. Daniel's bedroom door began to creak as if someone was inside. The candles seemed to want to go out and then come back on. Richard looked at me and said that Sarah was here. I didn't dare look around, just sat there with my hands on the edge of the sofa. Richard began to recite the words in Latin. The more he read the words, the more intense the air became. The faint knocking sounds began to circle the walls, as if someone was using a long, thin hand on wood. Daniel from the bedroom called out to his mother not to upset Sarah. His voice was no longer his own, but a cold, hollow sound. I could not bear it any longer and ran into Daniel's room to find him sitting on the bed with his face turned to the white face sitting in the shadow. On the desk was a new picture of Sarah. This time she was smiling triumphantly. Every picture was so vivid, it made me tremble. Richard came in after me, holding the cross up and saying that this soul must be released or it would never rest. But no amount of praying could distract the presence. The window began to swing slowly as if a strong wind was blowing from outside. The house was dark and quiet, so I was left alone in the darkness. In the darkness, I could clearly see a pair of dark eyes staring at me. I was so cold that I couldn't stop crying. Richard kept his composure and continued reading. Daniel began to cry and begged Sarah to stop. Everything only lasted a few minutes, but to me it felt like 1,000 hours. When I was picked up again, I saw the shadow disappear, but the air was still cold. Daniel lay on the bed, fast asleep with tears streaming down his face. Richard told me that Sarah's spirit was too strong to be cut off by prayer alone. He said that if I wanted to save Daniel, I had to find a way to face Sarah directly, understand her pain, and release it. Otherwise, Sarah would never leave. I couldn't sleep that night. Richard's words echoed in my head. Face to face with a spirit that could be more dangerous than all of them. But if it was the only way to free Daniel, I had no choice. But how could I talk to a spirit that was keeping her son alive? I spent the night thinking about what Richard had said. His words were a warning that time was running out. Daniel had been lured into Sarah's presence. If I didn't act soon, he would no longer be my son. I decided I had to face this matter head on, whatever the outcome. I waited until one night when Daniel was sound asleep. I turned off all the lights in the house, except for a small candle in the living room. I sat on the sofa, facing the darkness around me, and called Sarah's name. In the silence, all I could hear was the wind blowing through the window. But after only a few minutes, I began to notice something strange. The candle flickered and then began to fade. The temperature in the room dropped to a cold chill until the breath became a mist in the air. From the corner of the room, I saw a shadow appear. Her long, messy hair covered her dark eyes and looked straight at me. It was the image from the pictures of Daniel. I tried to speak, but I still tried to keep my voice steady. I told her that I knew her name was Sarah Mitchell, and I knew she had been through a heartbreak that nothing could cover. I asked her not to let Daniel go because he was just my baby. For a moment, the whole room seemed to stop. The woman's shadow became clearer, and I heard a soft female voice like the wind. The voice said that Daniel was her son, that he belonged to her, and that I had no right to keep him. The words were so cold that they pierced my soul. I tried to explain that he had a mother and a family, but Sarah laughed softly. Her smile was exactly like the one in Daniel's last picture. Many things in the house began to shake. The door slammed on the wall, revealing new scars. I understood that her presence was becoming difficult, but I could not give up. I continued to say that I knew her pain because I was also a mother, and I was also afraid of losing my son. This brought silence to the living room. In a few seconds, I saw Sarah's face as if she were filled with tears. But then, all the tears were replaced by a cold smile. She said that nothing could change the fact that Daniel had chosen her. Every word was like a decision. I trembled, but could not remove my eyes from the darkness. I understood that if I gave up now, I would never have Daniel again. At that moment, Daniel appeared in the doorway. B looked at me and then at Sarah with a cold look. B said that Sarah was kind and loved him more than me. His words were like a knife to my heart. I ran to hug Daniel, but he turned away and laughed at the shadow. It was like an open competition between me and Sarah. Richard appeared behind me and told me not to give up, that only a mother's perseverance could cut this mess. He started reading the words again. With each word he said, the atmosphere in the room became more and more stifling. Sarah's shadow wavered and became blurry, but her eyes were fixed on Daniel. Daniel cried and called Sarah's name. B begged her to stop. I held my child and finally said that if Sarah had really been a mother, she would understand that true love is to let her child live a life of freedom without constraints. Those words made the space vibrate, as if a strong wind had escaped from the room. The light was gone, leaving only my shadow. When the light returned, Sarah's shadow was gone, but there was still a feeling of warmth in the air. Daniel slept soundly in my arms, tears still streaming down his face. Richard said that this war has only just begun. Sarah will return because the connection with Daniel is too strong. If I want to stop it, I have to go to the place where her spirit began. Richard had said that to cut the connection I had to find the place where Sarah had disappeared. That meant going back to the place where everyone believed her life had ended. It had taken me a long time, but I had to accept it. Not because I wanted to, but because otherwise Daniel would never escape the clutches of this demon. I started wandering around Sarah's neighborhood. Every little piece of information could be a new start. A neighbor said that the last time she had seen Sarah was when she went to the old cemetery in Ria Thitran. No one had seen her since. It sounded like many other creepy stories, but to me, it was a guide. I decided to go to the cemetery. The afternoon was dark and windy, carrying the smell of damp earth. Daniel didn't want to go, but I couldn't leave him alone. The boy held my hand, but he rubbed it away as if he belonged somewhere else. Every step on the way to the cemetery was heavy, as if it wanted to stop me at any moment. The cemetery was on a small hill. The gravestones were tilted as if they were about to collapse. The sand was high above our heads, making the scene even more gloomy. As I led Daniel between the rows of graves, I felt a chill. The atmosphere here was different from any other place I'd ever been. It was as if all the trapped souls were looking at us. After a while of searching, I found a gravestone that was completely different from the others. The neighbors said that was where Sarah was thought to lie, but her body was never found. There was only one grave on the ground. Daniel stood in front of him, his face pale. He said Sarah was there. The words sent a chill down my spine. I knelt down and touched the cold gravestone. Many images of graves appeared in my head. A woman with dark eyes was holding a baby. Then all disappeared except for the sound of a soft cry. I turned to Daniel and saw him drawing a picture on the ground with a stick. The picture was of a long-haired woman standing right behind me. My heart was pounding. I turned around and saw nothing but the passing of time. But in my heart, I knew Sarah was there. Daniel started to hold my hand and said Sarah wanted us to stay with her. I was so scared that I ran away from the grave. But even though I left the cemetery, the feeling of coldness still lingered. When I got home, I couldn't get used to that feeling. That night, Daniel painted a new painting. It showed the three of us, Daniel and Sarah, standing round a grave. The painting was exactly like the scene from the cemetery. What shook me was the image of my mother in the painting, so pale and faded that she seemed to have disappeared. Richard came to see the painting and said that Sarah's wish had become almost a promise. If I didn't break this cycle, Daniel would be trapped forever. He said that the only way to get back to the beginning was to talk to the spirit and free it from its sadness. That meant I had to go back to the cemetery at midnight, which was considered the strongest time to contact the other world. I didn't want to do it, but I had no choice. Daniel's change was becoming more and more obvious. B became cold to me, but always smiled at the invisible shadow in the corner of the house. Every night I could clearly see a pair of eyes looking into his bedroom. If I waited any longer, I would lose him forever. I began to prepare for the journey at midnight. My heart was filled with fear, but also with determination. Nothing was more important than saving Daniel. Even if I had to face the silence of one person, I would do it. That night, I left Daniel with my son Richard and carried a candle and a cross to the cemetery. The air was cold as I walked step by step among the ancient tombstones. The sun was setting, casting a dark shadow on the ground. Every small sound was like a warning, making my heart pound. I found the unmarked grave where Sarah was believed to be buried. I set the candle on the ground and prayed. The words of the prayer escaped me as if carried away by the wind. The air around me was so hot that I had to lean against someone to breathe. I began to call Sarah's name softly. At first, there was only silence. But after a few minutes, the air grew colder. The wind seemed to stop. The sand stood still and motionless. From the corner of the cemetery, I saw a shadow appear. The water behind me was cold. The more I looked, the clearer it became. The dark eyes of the afternoon sun came into me. I told her that I knew she was there and that I had come to talk to her. I said that I understood the pain she was going through and that I, too, was afraid of losing my son. The words rang out in the night like a challenge. The shadow of the woman moved closer. In the dim light of the tree, I could clearly see her long, disheveled hair and the cold smile on her lips. Sarah's voice rang out like wind through the skin. She said that Daniel belonged to her and that only with her could he be protected. The words were not only cold, but also like a promise. I tried to keep my spirits up and replied that the baby really had a mother, and that true love was to set the baby free and not be swept away. The ground shook slightly under my head and called out to me. The gravestones around me creaked as if someone was calling from inside. Sarah's faint laugh echoed throughout the space. That laugh was no longer just on my lips, but in my ears. Each laugh was like a needle stabbing into my chest. In that moment, I saw a small figure appear right next to Sarah, a child with clear eyes filled with sadness. I realized that this could be Sarah's lost child. The sight made my heart shatter into pieces. If she really only wanted to be with her son, why did she take Daniel? I gathered all my courage and said that if Sarah wanted to rest in peace, she would have to accept the fact that her son was gone. I promised to pray for her every day if she would forgive Daniel. Every word I said was from the heart of a mother. In a few seconds, I changed Sarah's face as if it was softening. The shadow of the child beside her also faded. But in just a split second, her cold smile returned. She said that it was too late. Daniel had chosen her, and nothing could change it. Those words were like a frozen door before my eyes. Now the sound of the strong wind was beginning to fade. I held the cross in my hands and prayed continuously. A sudden glimmer of light fell from the veil. In the other circle, Sarah's silhouette wavered. Her voice was colder than before, but still a little hesitant. I knew I had touched her deepest part, but that was not enough to break the cycle. Richard had stopped me and said that only by returning with a proper ritual could I break the cycle. I left the cemetery feeling both defeated and hopeful. Sarah had been worried and had told me of the long battles that lay ahead. Daniel was still not free. Every time I looked at him, he seemed so distant that he no longer belonged to me. I returned home feeling both defeated and determined. Daniel was still not freed. Every time I looked at him, it was clear that he was no longer my childhood child. His eyes were cold, but when he thought of Sarah, they lit up with strange joy. Richard told me that the only way was to perform a final ritual right in this house. In the paranormal stories I had heard, every ritual to communicate with the other world was fraught with danger. If it failed, the soul would become simpler and more material. But I had no choice. I agreed with Richard that I would do anything to save Daniel. We began to prepare. Richard drew the symbols on the floor on 10 pages. Each symbol is like a net that can hold the soul and prevent it from escaping. I placed the last painting that Daniel had of Sarah in the middle of the circle. The painting is like a door between two worlds. Each candle is placed around the living room, creating a circle of golden light. Daniel sat quietly in my arms, but his eyes were not looking at me, but at the darkness in the corner of the room. He smiled faintly and said that Sarah was here. Those words made my skin crawl. Richard began to recite the incantations in Latin, his voice full of authority and weight. Each incantation was like a knife piercing the air, shaking the whole house. In another circle, the temperature in the room dropped suddenly. The candles trembled and some of them died. The window slammed shut as if in a wind, but everything was still. In the middle of Daniel's circle of paintings, the ink began to run as if tears were falling from within. A woman's shadow appeared on the wall, long hair and a cold smile. Sarah was there. Her eyes were fixed on Daniel. He reached out as if to be hugged. I held my child in my arms and cried. I begged Sarah to spare my child. The shrill laughter only grew louder. Richard continued to read, his voice growing stronger. The circle began to glow, sending out rays of light that wiped away the shadow. But Sarah was not to be moved. Things in the house began to shake. Paintings on the wall fell. The ceiling shook. Daniel cried and called for Sarah. Every word was like a curse on my head. I had to use all my motherly courage to save my son. Richard told me to speak directly to Sarah. He said that only a mother's true feelings could cut through this. I turned to look at the woman's figure wavering in the circle. I said that I understood her pain, that I knew that losing a child was the most terrible thing. I promised to remember her as a mother who had lost a child. In that moment, Sarah's eyes seemed to glisten. The laughter stopped, leaving only the sound of the wind. The woman's figure became the most pale, but only in that moment the cold smile returned. Her father said that Daniel was her son, and nothing would change that. Every word was like a declaration. Richard increased his speed of prayer. The light was so bright that it was like fire. Sarah's shadow began to recede, but her eyes were fixed on Daniel. He kept calling Sarah each time. My heart beat so hard that it felt like it was about to disappear. The first time lasted longer than an hour. Every minute became a torture for my spirit. When the ceremony was almost over, a sudden gust of wind blew into the house, and all the lights went out. The space that led into the darkness was cold. When the light returned, Sarah's shadow had disappeared, but the air was still warm. Daniel fainted in my arms. Richard said that this was just the beginning. Sarah refused to let go easily. She would come back. If I wanted to end it all, I had to face her where she had died. The cemetery will be the final destination. After the failed ceremony, I knew I had only one chance. Richard said that if Sarah refused to leave the house, we would have to force her back to the place where she had last been found. The cemetery on the horizon became the final resting place. If I could not save Daniel there, I would lose him forever. In the following days, Daniel became different. He spoke less to me, but often laughed alone. Many times, he said that Sarah told him fairy tales. The stories no longer sounded like a child's voice, but like a grown woman whispering into his ear. Each time, my heart ached and I was afraid. Richard began to prepare for the final ceremony. He brought candles, white salt, and some other items that he said would help close the loop between Daniel and Sarah. He warned me that the ceremony was dangerous because if it failed, Sarah would not only touch Daniel but also me. The warning chilled me to the bone, but I had no choice. That night, I took Daniel and Richard to the cemetery. It was dark and covered with dark curtains. The wind made the sand rustle. Every step inside felt like stepping into another world. Daniel took my hand, but I was no longer afraid. His eyes lit up as if he knew he was about to be reunited with Sarah. We stood in front of the unmarked grave where Sarah was believed to have been buried. Richard began to draw a circle of salt around the headstone. He placed the stones around us and told Daniel and me to step into the circle. I held Daniel in my arms, but he tried to move away. He smiled and said Sarah was coming. A few minutes later, the atmosphere changed. The temperature dropped suddenly. The wind stopped. The space was so hot that every breath was sucked out. From behind the tombstone, a shadow began to appear. Her long hair flew in the wind behind her, and she smiled coldly. Sarah had come. Richard began to read the words carefully, and his voice echoed throughout the cemetery. Sarah's shadow wavered and became clearer. Her eyes focused on Daniel. Bea reached out, but I held her close and wouldn't let her. Sarah smiled and moved closer. With each step she took, the ground trembled under her feet. I tried to tell Sarah that I understood her pain, but Daniel was not the son she had lost. I begged her to spare my son. In the silence, Sarah's voice rang out. She said I would never understand, that only those who had lost their children could understand the pain. Her cold words made the air around her become more suffocating. The winds began to blow harder, as if blown by a wind even though there was no wind. The halo of light played and made Sarah's shadow shake. Richard asked me to continue talking to her. He said only a mother's sincerity could free her. I gathered all my courage and looked into the dark eyes behind me and said that I was afraid of losing Daniel too, that I could not live if that happened. I said I would never let anyone, anything, ever take my son away. Every word from my heart was like a ray of light in the darkness. In a few seconds, Sarah's eyes seemed to glisten with tears. Her shadow disappeared. But only a second later, the cold smile returned. She swore that Daniel was hers, and nothing could change that. The hour began to blow hard, sending salt flying from the circle. A flame went out. Richard told me to keep Daniel and not to lose sight. It all turned into a battle between despair and a mother's love. The whole cemetery shook. The gravestones seemed to echo with words of mourning. I knew this battle was not over yet. Without drastic action, Sarah will never leave. The cemetery shook beneath my feet. The lights around the salt circle began to fade. Daniel cried bitterly in my arms, but his small eyes were not directed at me, but at Sarah. Her cold laughter still echoed in the air, as if it were reverberating in my head. Richard read faster and faster, but the sand flew, causing the salt circle to break in that moment. I understood that I could no longer rely on Richard alone. If I wanted to save Daniel, I had to face Sarah myself. I put my child down inside the salt circle and stood straight in front of the slowly approaching shadow. Her long hair fluttered in the wind. Her dark eyes looked at me thoughtfully. I said that I understood her pain and that I was also a mother. I told him that I had lived in fear of Daniel even when he was still alive. Every time I saw him smile to an invisible shadow, I felt like I was being robbed. I begged Sarah not to take my child because he was not the child she had lost. For a moment, Sarah's eyes seemed to sparkle, but then the smile returned. He said that I could not understand the pain of a mother who had lost everything. The words stuck to a dark wind that had swallowed everything that was left. My shadow surrounded the cemetery. Daniel cried and called Sarah's name. Her voice was no longer a child's, but a cold, haunting voice. Richard tried to recapture the circle by calling out his final words. Sarah's shadows were everywhere on the gravestones and the trees. I held Daniel and felt the baby's warmth draining away as if all the life had been sucked out of him. I knew that if I didn't do anything, he would no longer belong to me. I used all my courage to step out of the circle. Richard told me to stop, but I didn't listen. I knew that only by standing alone facing Sarah would I have a chance to save Daniel. When I stood in the middle of the cemetery, alone facing Sarah, it was deathly silent. Only the rustling of the wind on the sand could be heard. Sarah was clearer than ever. The smile on her lips was like a challenge. I used all my strength to hold my voice and say that if she had ever been a mother, she would understand that true love is giving her child freedom without being tied down. In that moment, space fluctuated. Sarah's shadow flickered and wavered fiercely. Her eyes stared at me like a warning that it wasn't over. Daniel called my name softly. That call was the motivation for me not to give up. Richard shouted that I had to continue. He said that only my perseverance could cut the curse. I didn't dare turn around, just looked straight into Sarah's eyes. I told her that I would never let anyone steal Daniel's eyes, even if he was better. Each word was like a golden oath in the dark. Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet shook. A large mark on the tombstone had opened wide. Now the wind was stronger, blowing away all the sand. Sarah's shadow melted and came back together. Each time it melted, she appeared closer. I felt cold but still. I knew that one touch of my love would cost me everything. This battle between me and my son was not only a battle of survival, but also of motherhood. Every second passed like a blink of an eye. Daniel began to weaken in Richard's arms. If I didn't end it in time, my son wouldn't survive the night. The ground beneath my feet shook more and more violently. The knob on the tombstone opened wide like a giant mouth swallowing all the light. The hour began to slow down, and then the rain suddenly fell. The sound of the rain hitting the ground on the tombstone on the salt circle sounded like a cry echoing from the heart of the earth. Each sound of rain falling into the night turned into a cold rain sound that made my heart ache. Daniel in Richard's heart was weak. He occasionally called Sarah's name with a voice that was no longer a child. Each call was like a string of glue, drawing her soul closer. Sarah appeared right in front of the tombstone, her cold smile on her lips, spreading across the cemetery. Her long hair fluttered in the rain wind, making her silhouette even more terrifying. I walked to the grave and said that if Sarah wanted to rest in peace, she should let Daniel go. I begged her to remember her real son instead of stealing mine. For a few seconds, Sarah's eyes wavered. But then she smiled and said that my tears were meaningless. The wind and rain were stronger than her allies. Richard stood behind and read continuously. Each sentence seemed to be carried by the wind, but also made the space waver. Sarah's shadow was pushed back a few steps, but only a moment later it came forward. The candles around everyone had only the first light of the setting sun on the cemetery. Each flare of light appeared clearer than Sarah's cold face. I held Daniel in my arms. He was cold, as if all the life had been sucked out. I knew that if I didn't end it now, I would lose my child forever. I turned to Richard and asked what I should do. He told me to say my last words to Sarah with all the love of a mother. He said that only true love can destroy words. I shouted into the wind and said that I was not afraid of losing my mother. I was not afraid of losing everything, but I would never lose Daniel. I promised that if Sarah would forgive my child, I would keep her memory as a mother who loved her child until the end. The words from the heart made the space quiet for a few seconds. Sarah's shadow shook. Her eyes were glistening as if she had tears. For a moment, I believed that she would let go. But then, from the mark on the tombstone, a warm wind rose. Sarah smiled coldly back. My father said that every promise was just a promise. Daniel was hers, and nothing would change. In the storm, I felt as if I were being erased from my own life. Every drop of rain that fell was like music, that I was on the border between life and death, between hope and despair. Daniel fainted in my arms. Richard could barely stand it anymore, but he still read the words to the end. The light flared up again. The gravestones were almost closed. Sarah's shadow appeared everywhere in the cemetery. With every step she took, the rain seemed to stop my chance. I knew this battle was not over, and what lay ahead was much more terrifying. The ground beneath my feet was like a wave. The gravestone was swept away until a loud sound echoed throughout the cemetery. The ground echoed with the sound of raindrops falling far away, making everything immersed in a cold mist. From the shadow of the woman's head began to take shape. Sarah stepped out of the ground with her long hair flying in the wind. Her eyes glowed darkly like two bodies without legs. I hugged Daniel, but he was cold. Richard read words continuously, but his voice was swallowed by the wind. Sarah laughed coldly, each laugh like the sound of a knife cutting through space. She was no longer just a shadow, but a clear figure that could touch me. Every step she took made the sand and rain tremble. I knew this struggle was not just between me and another woman, but between a mother's love and the despair of someone who had lost everything. Sarah pretended to say that Daniel was her son. Her father held out his hand as if to take the child from my arms. I shouted with all my might that he was mine, that nothing could change that. In that moment, I saw the shadow of a child appear behind Sarah, the child with sad eyes like the old photo in the diary I found. Maybe he was her real son. The shadow took Sarah's hand and her eyes wavered. But in a split second, the cold smile returned. Sarah screamed more than the thunderclap that pierced the sky. Richard told me not to give up. He said that only when I accepted Sarah's pain and freed her would I have a chance to save Daniel. I cried and screamed that I understood that my eyes were a wound that would never heal. I swore that I would never forget her, that every story of hers would be told like a song. In a few seconds, the hours seemed to stop. The rain poured, then slowed down. Sarah's shadow wavered violently, her eyes glistening as if there was something between longing and sadness. Daniel opened his eyes to look at me, then at Sarah with a tearful gaze. He called both of our names. Each call tore my heart apart. Sarah stepped closer, but the shadow of the child beside her appeared more clearly. The child said nothing, just looked at her mother with a deep gaze. I understood that this was the decisive moment. If Sarah chose Daniel, she would never be free. If she accepted the pain, she would go with her child. I cried out that love is not about keeping, but about letting go. That if Sarah truly loved her child, she would let him have the chance to live another life. The words from my heart pierced through the stormy wind. In that moment, the stone was placed on the tombstone, creating a beam of light that illuminated the cemetery. Sarah's shadow shook violently. Her mother's eyes were filled with tears, and then she died. The child's shadow embraced her mother, and both died into space. However, it did not end there. Daniel was in my arms. Richard said that Sarah's soul might have been freed, but her vows could still be held. I understood that it was not enough. All this is just the beginning of something even more terrifying that lies ahead. After the bird cemetery fell silent, Richard and I took Daniel home. My son slept soundly, but his face was as white as if all the life had been sucked out of him. I hoped it was all just a nightmare, and that when he woke up, he would return to normal. But I still had the nagging feeling that the curse was not over. The first few days seemed normal. Daniel no longer called Sarah's name at night, and he was less visible. I almost believed that it was all over. To get some time off and make him happy, I took him to a picnic in the woods near the forest. I wanted him to imagine life as a normal child again. The first few days in the woods were clear blue skies and cool breezes. Daniel smiled again as he ran around with his little dog. I felt hope return. The first night outside, the sound of birds chirping and rustling leaves. It was like a peaceful film. I lay in the fire while Daniel sat on the baby's lap. I thought she was going to the trees or the woods, but when I looked closely at the paper, my heart went cold. Daniel saw a long-haired woman standing between the trees. Her face was hidden by the shadow, but her eyes were dark. Next to her was a smiling child. I was startled and took the child's hand, but the child smiled softly and said Sarah was only coming. The words were like a repeated prophecy. That night when the fire went out, I heard the rustling of leaves all around. The wind was still, but the leaves were still rustling, as if someone was around. Daniel was sleeping soundly, but every now and then the child smiled as if talking to someone. I held the baby close to me and listened to my heart pounding. Every sound outside became music that Sarah had not left. The next morning I told Richard on the phone. He said that the connection between Daniel and Sarah had not been broken, but because we were no longer near the tombstone, her presence had weakened. He advised me not to be complacent and to always be vigilant. Those words made my heart heavy. Daniel continued to come back in the following nights. Each visit was of Sarah. Sometimes she smiled coldly, sometimes she looked at me with sad eyes. Each visit was like a warning that Sarah had not ended. I began to feel that this journey was more like a flight than a rest. On the third night, it began to rain. The sound of rain on the screen sounded like someone knocking on a door. Daniel opened his eyes and looked at me and said that Sarah was outside waiting for him. His words made my stomach churn. I held my breath and prayed that everything was just bad luck. In my shadow, I saw a shadow move across the screen. My heart stopped beating. I didn't dare to go out, but I knew that Sarah hadn't forgiven Daniel. The curse was still there. The rain poured down, making our Lee tremble. Every drop of rain hitting my shoulder. My nose sounded like someone calling from inside my shadow. Daniel lay close to me, but his eyes were open. He laughed and said Sarah was here. His voice sounded like a cold melody in the night. I held Daniel's body in my arms. Outside, the rustling sound was clear, not the wind. It was like someone was walking around me. The sound of footsteps on the ground was very clear. With each step closer, my heart beat faster. I remembered Richard's words that I should not look at Sarah without protection. But at that moment, I had no other choice. A figure appeared in the shadow outside the Lee. In the light of the open door, I saw long, disheveled hair and dark eyes looking in. Daniel was laughing with the shadow. He raised his hand as if to open the window. I held his hand and held it. Every effort he made to laugh made my heart skip a beat. The wind blew so hard that the trees swayed. The rain fell from time to time. The sound became a melodious melody like crying. Sarah was not only outside, but seemed to be everywhere around us. I decided to do something. I took out from my pocket a small coin that Richard had given me before he left. I held it high and cried out for Sarah to spare my child. My cry was swallowed by the rain and the swaying shadows outside. In another moment, I saw Sarah's eyes glistening with tears. Daniel began to cry. B said that Sarah was calling and that he didn't want to leave her. Those words broke my heart, but I didn't give up. I told her that she was my everything, that nothing could change a mother's love for her child. Each word was like a string of glue that Daniel returned to. Outside, the woman's shadow slowed. The time seemed to soften a little. I believed that my words had an effect, but only a moment later, a flash of lightning landed nearby. Its sound shook the whole body. Sarah's shadow became clearer than ever. A cold smile appeared on her lips. Daniel cried out. B held out her hand to show that Sarah was waiting. B's face was as white as paper. I held the baby in my arms, but felt the baby's strength fading. My tears turned cold with the rain. I knew if I didn't end this night, I would lose my baby forever. In the room, I decided to face Sarah directly. I walked out near the door in the middle of the cold rain. The woman's shadow was like a tree branch. Her eyes were staring straight at me. Every second of her eyes was like a final challenge. The rain was pouring down on me as I stepped out of the rain. The wind was strong, carrying the smell of damp earth and dry grass. In the darkness of the forest, I could clearly see Sarah standing on the edge of a tree. Her long hair was flying around her shoulders. Her eyes were dark and bright like two pools of water behind a cloudless sky. A cold smile appeared on her lips like a call. I knew that if I turned back into the rain, I would lose Daniel. So I walked slowly closer to Sarah. Each step was like being sucked into an invisible vortex. The falling rain no longer sounded like the sound of nature, but like a long cry. Each drop was a reminder that I had no chance of escape. When I was only a few steps away from her, Sarah held out her hand. The front hand had scratches, as if it had been held in the ground for a long time. She said that Daniel was her son and that he had chosen to stay with her. The words rang in the wind like a verdict. I held the child in my arms and looked straight into her eyes. That I was a mother too, and I would never lose sight of Daniel. Every word came from my heart like a spark in the dark. Sarah laughed in a low voice. She asked me how I would live if Daniel were taken away. The question cut into my heart like a knife. My tears turned cold with rain and ran down my legs. I replied that I would not live if I lost Daniel, but because of that I understood that Sarah had felt the same way. I said that true love is to let you be free, not to force you. In a few seconds, my voice seemed to make Sarah waver. Her eyes were glistening with tears, but the storm did not give me time to rejoice. The sound of the hammering pierced the bright sky. Sarah's shadow became clearer than ever. My mother stepped closer, her bright eyes looking deep into my heart. Daniel called out Sarah's name from the darkness. Each call was closer and closer. I ran back to the door, crying to my son that I could not call anymore. Daniel cried and said that he did not want Sarah to be sad. His words made my heart ache. I understood that my child was not being taken away by force, but by love. That was the most important thing. Sarah stood right behind me. The passing cold wind can chill me. My father said that my love was just a lie that I never understood. The words echoed through the air like a never-ending ghost. I turned to look straight at my grandmother. In another moment, I saw a child standing next to my grandmother. The child's eyes walked silently. I realized that it was Sarah's real child. The child looked at her mother with eyes full of sadness. It seemed like a final cry. I gathered all my courage and said that if Sarah really loved her child, she would go with her to a place where they could both rest. The words rang through the night like a prayer. In another moment, the wind stopped and the rain stopped. Sarah's shadow shook violently. Tears glistened in her eyes. The child embraced her, and they both fell into space. I heard a long sigh, like a release, but space did not return to normal immediately. The forest was still cold. Daniel slept soundly in my arms. I knew that the ordeal was not over. This riddle might have been partially solved, but the echoes were still there. Coming home after the storm, I just wanted to believe that everything was over. Daniel slept soundly for days in a row, as if something had sucked all the life out of him. I gently rocked him, hoping that when he woke up, he would no longer remember Sarah. But after only a few days, unusual signs appeared again. Daniel did not smile as much as before. He started to return. At first, it was just a vague image, but then it became clearer. Every image was Sarah. His father stood behind Daniel and looked at me with a cold smile. My heart skipped a beat every time I saw him. One night, I found Daniel awake in the middle of the night. He was sitting on the bed with his hair tossed and turned. He looked at me with a distant look and said that Sarah was still not gone. It sounded like a verdict. I trembled as I tried to take it from my hand, but Daniel held it tight and refused to let go. I showed it to Richard. He pondered it for a long time and then said that Sarah's body might not be completely freed. When a soul is trapped for too long, it can become a ghost. If that happened, Sarah would come back not to find release, but to get back what she had lost. Richard's words sent a chill down my spine. The following nights were filled with strange sounds in the house. Footsteps echoed on the floor, even though we were only on one floor. Windows opened automatically, even though there was no wind. The shadow of a long-haired woman appeared in the mirror and then disappeared. Each time I knew that Sarah was closer than ever. Daniel drifted further and further away from me. Be quiet and focused on her. Every time I asked her what she wanted, she would simply reply that she wanted her to stay. But those words were like needles stabbing into my heart. I knew that this curse was not over. I began to feel haunted too. Many nights I dreamed that Sarah was sitting on the edge of the bed. She said nothing but smiled coldly. Every time I woke up, my body was drenched in sweat. Daniel slept beside her, but the smile in her dream was exactly like Sarah's. Richard suggested we do another serious ritual, this time in the house with all the protection. He said that there was only one last chance to end the affair. If it failed, Sarah would return with all her worries. The warning was like a decree. I had no choice. If I didn't save Daniel, I would lose him forever. But deep down, I knew Sarah was no longer a sad soul. She had turned into a haunting ghost. Every step I took in the house felt like her eyes were following me. That night, Richard returned to my house with all the necessary materials for the final ceremony. He said that if the test failed, Sarah would not only touch Daniel, but also become an apparition from which I could not escape. The warning made my heart pound, but I had no choice. Daniel sat in my lap with his eyes distant, as if he belonged somewhere else. The living room was dark, except for the lamps, forming a circle. Richard painted a 10-page sign on the floor and placed the painting of Daniel and Sarah in the middle. Each face looked like it was alive. I felt as if the eyes in the painting were looking straight at me. The ceremony began. Richard read the inscriptions in a deep but powerful voice. Every word escaped the air in the room. The wind seemed to stop, leaving only the sound of a thin cry. Daniel cried and called Sarah. Each word was like a needle stabbing into my heart. Suddenly, the window slammed open. The cold wind blew in, making the ceiling tremble. The shadow of a woman appeared on the wall, her long hair flying, her eyes darkening in the afternoon. Sarah was there. The smile on her lips was colder than all. I hugged Daniel and begged her to spare my son. Richard continued to read. The circle glowed, casting rays of light. Sarah let out a cold laugh. She cried out that Daniel was hers, that he had chosen to stay. Each word was like a declaration. The objects in the house shook. Pictures on the wall fell to pieces. The door was screaming. Everything was like a sack in my pocket. I yelled that if Sarah really loved her child, she would go with her and spare Daniel. My words made the space silent for a few seconds. In another circle, a small shadow appeared beside Sarah. The child, with clear eyes, hugged her mother. Sarah's eyes were sparkling as if there were tears. But only a moment later, the cold smile returned. She said that it was all a lie, that she would never leave. Richard increased his speed to pray. The circle of light grew so bright that I had to cover my eyes. Sarah's shadow wavered strongly and then melted, but then came back together at another corner. Each time it melted, it seemed to gain strength. Daniel fell into my arms and fell asleep with tears running down his cheeks. I knew this struggle was far from over. Without drastic action, Sarah would become an inseparable part of me. Each second passed like a frozen window before my eyes.